cold October rain lashed against the steel visor of the French vanguard as they stood knee-deep in the churning mud of Agincourt in the year 1415. Every breath was a struggle against the suffocating weight of 60 pounds of plate armor and the crushing press of thousands of men and horses packed into the narrow valley. The rhythmic thrumming of English longbows released a deadly swarm that darkened the gray sky like a plague of locusts descending upon the harvest. There was no glory in this moment, only the primal instinct to survive the incoming storm of bodkin arrows designed to punch through steel. The air reeked of wet iron and nervous sweat as the flower of French nobility prepared to charge into a wall of wooden stakes. Victory or death hung in the balance not just for the men on the field, but for the future of the French crown itself. A loss here would decimate the ruling class and leave the kingdom vulnerable to total English conquest. The stakes were absolute, and the cost of failure was the annihilation of an entire generation of knights. These men were the tanks of the medieval world, and they were about to face a weapon that threatened to render their centuries of dominance obsolete. The battlefield was a slaughterhouse waiting to happen, where the romantic ideals of chivalry would collide violently with the brutal efficiency of massed infantry and projectile warfare. Among the chaotic mass of steel and silk stood Jean de la Menger, known as Boucicaut, a marshal of France and a paragon of the knightly ideal. He was a man who had traveled the known world and fought in crusades from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. Boucicaut represented the pinnacle of the warrior aristocracy, trained from boyhood to master the horse, the sword, and the lance. His armor was a masterpiece of Italian engineering, designed to deflect the deadliest blows, and his spirit was fortified by a lifetime of adherence to the code of chivalry. Yet as he looked across the muddy field at the ragged English archers, he faced a terrifying uncertainty that no amount of honor could mitigate. Could the sheer brute force of the armored charge overcome the disciplined mechanics of the English longbow and the treacherous terrain? This was the question that haunted the commanders as the trumpets sounded the advance. The knights believed their heavy plate and destriers would crush the lightly armored archers like wheat under a millstone. They trusted in the shock of impact and the superiority of their social station to carry the day. But war is rarely a respecter of status, and the physics of mud and velocity were about to render a harsh verdict on the age of the mounted knight. The answer came swiftly and with devastating brutality as the French charge bogged down in the quagmire of the plowed field. Horses stumbled and fell, throwing their riders into the suffocating muck where they were helpless against the swarming English infantry. The reveal was a catastrophic defeat for the French nobility, where thousands were killed or taken prisoner, including the great Boucicaut himself. The aftermath of Agincourt sent a shockwave through Europe, signaling that the days of the invincible mounted knight were numbered. It was a harsh lesson that armor and lineage were no guarantee of victory against a disciplined and pragmatic enemy. This dramatic clash at Agincourt serves as a perfect lens through which to examine the reality of the medieval knight. Far from the sanitized fairy tales of shining armor and damsels in distress, the life of a knight was one of grueling physical hardship and immense financial burden. To understand the knight, we must look past the romantic literature and examine the social and military engine that produced these ironclad warriors. The knight was the cornerstone of the feudal system, a warrior caste granted land in exchange for military service. This arrangement shaped the political landscape of Europe for centuries, creating a society organized entirely around the needs of war. The origins of knighthood can be traced back to the collapse of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Carolingian heavy cavalry in the 8th century. As central authority crumbled, local lords needed a way to protect their holdings and project power. The solution was the mounted warrior capable of rapid movement and overwhelming shock action. These early knights were often rough mercenaries rather than noble paragons, but over time they coalesced into a distinct social class. The introduction of the stirrup allowed a rider to brace himself and deliver a blow with the full momentum of the horse, transforming cavalry from mobile skirmishers into a devastating shock force. By the High Middle Ages, the system of feudalism had solidified the position of the knight at the top of the martial hierarchy. A king would grant large tracts of land called fiefs to his great barons, who in turn would parcel out smaller estates to knights. In return for this income, the knight was obligated to provide 40 days of military service each year, along with other feudal dues. This economic foundation allowed the knight to afford the incredibly expensive equipment and horses required for his profession. Without the labor of the peasantry to generate wealth, the armored knight could not exist. The training of a knight began at a very young age, usually around 7 years old, when a boy was sent to the household of a superior lord to serve as a page. This was not a childhood of leisure, but a rigorous education in manners, hunting, and basic combat skills. The page learned to ride before he could read, and he spent his days serving his lord at the table and maintaining weapons. He absorbed the culture of the nobility, learning the intricate rules of heraldry and the expectations of courtly behavior. It was a time of indoctrination where the young boy learned his place in the hierarchy. At the age of 14, the page graduated to the rank of squire, and his military training began in earnest. As a squire, he was attached to a specific knight, acting as his personal assistant and body servant. He cared for the horses, polished the armor, and even accompanied his master onto the battlefield. The squire learned the handling of the sword, the lance, and the shield through hours of daily practice with heavy wooden wasters. He was toughened by physical conditioning, wrestling, and mock combats that left him bruised and exhausted. This apprenticeship was crucial for building the strength and stamina needed to fight in heavy armor. The bond between a knight and his squire was often close and familial, forged in the shared hardships of campaign life. The squire witnessed the reality of war firsthand, seeing the wounds, the disease, and the fear that accompanied every campaign. He learned how to forage for food, how to set up camp, and how to keep spirits high during long marches. It was a practical education that stripped away illusions and prepared him for the brutal responsibilities of command. Only when he had proven his skill and courage, usually in his early 20s, would he be considered for knighthood. The ceremony of dubbing was a pivotal moment that transformed a squire into a member of the warrior elite. In the early days, it was a simple affair on the battlefield, a blow to the neck or shoulder known as the collay. However, as the church sought to civilize the warrior class, the ceremony became a religious ritual. The candidate would bathe to purify himself, keep a vigil of prayer in a chapel overnight, and dress in white to symbolize purity. He would receive his sword from a bishop or a high-ranking lord, swearing oaths to protect the church, the poor, and the weak. Religion played a complex and often contradictory role in the life of a knight. The church struggled to reconcile the violent profession of the knight with the peaceful teachings of Christianity. The concept of the truce of God attempted to limit warfare on certain days, while the Crusades channeled the aggression of the knightly class towards external enemies. Knights were encouraged to see themselves as soldiers of Christ fighting for a holy cause. This fusion of piety and violence created a unique psychological framework where slaughter could be justified as a religious act if directed against the enemies of the faith. The equipment of the knight was his livelihood and his life insurance, and it evolved constantly over the centuries. In the 11th and 12th centuries, the primary defense was chainmail, a flexible mesh of thousands of riveted iron rings. A full hauberk of mail offered excellent protection against slashing cuts, but was vulnerable to the crushing impact of blunt weapons and the piercing power of arrows. Beneath the mail, the knight wore a padded gambeson to absorb shock and prevent chafing. This combination was heavy and hot, but it allowed for a reasonable range of movement. As weapons became more powerful, armor had to adapt, leading to the development of transitional armor in the 13th century. Knights began to add solid plates of steel to protect vital areas like the knees and elbows and shins. The great helm enclosed the entire head, offering superior protection, but severely limiting vision and breathing. This period saw a constant arms race between the offensive power of crossbows and war hammers and the defensive capabilities of the armorer. The knight was becoming a walking fortress encased in layers of steel and leather and padding. By the 15th century, the knight was encased in a full suit of articulated plate armor, a marvel of medieval engineering. A high-quality suit of Milanese or Gothic plate weighed between 50 and 60 pounds, but the weight was distributed evenly across the body. Contrary to popular belief, a knight in full plate was not a lumbering turtle, he was surprisingly agile. He could run, jump, mount a horse, and even climb a ladder. The articulation of the joints allowed for a full range of motion, while the angled surfaces of the steel were designed to deflect sword blows and arrows. The cost of such armor was astronomical, comparable to the price of a luxury sports car or a small house in modern terms. A knight had to pay for his own equipment, and the expense often drove lesser nobles into debt. A full harness required the skills of master armorers, polishers, and locksmiths working for weeks or months. The steel had to be tempered and hardened to resist penetration, and the fit had to be custom tailored to the individual. This financial barrier ensured that the best protection was reserved for the wealthy elite, reinforcing the class divide on the battlefield. The offensive arsenal of the knight was just as varied and specialized as his defense. The sword was the symbol of his status, a cruciform weapon that served as both a tool of war and a badge of office. However, against plate armor, a sword was often ineffective as a cutting weapon. Knights learned to use the sword as a lever or a thrusting implement, aiming for the gaps in the armor at the armpits or the visor. They also employed half-swording techniques, gripping the blade itself to drive the point home with greater precision and force. For smashing through plate armor, the knight turned to more brutal instruments like the mace, the warhammer, and the poleaxe. The poleaxe was perhaps the ultimate weapon for foot combat, combining a heavy axe blade, a crushing hammerhead, and a sharp spike. It could hook limbs, crush helmets, and pierce breastplates with terrifying efficiency. These weapons required immense strength to wield, and the combat they produced was a savage affair of concussive blows and bone-breaking impact. There was no finesse in a mace blow to the head, only the grim physics of mass and acceleration. Yet the primary weapon of the knight in the open field was the lance used to deliver the shock of the charge. The couched lance technique, where the weapon was clamped firmly under the armpit, allowed the rider to transfer the full momentum of the horse into the point of the lance. A mass charge of knights hitting home was like a rolling earthquake, capable of shattering infantry formations and driving opponents into the dust. The sound of lances shattering and wood splintering was the defining auditory experience of medieval warfare. The partner in this destruction was the warhorse, specifically the destrier. These were not the massive draft horses often depicted in movies, but agile and muscular animals bred for aggression and stamina. A good warhorse was trained to bite and kick, to ignore the noise of battle, and to charge directly into a wall of men. The cost of a destrier was immense, often equaling the price of the armor itself. Losing a horse in battle was a financial catastrophe for a knight, and often meant a loss of status. The concept of chivalry is inseparable from the image of the knight, but the reality was often far removed from the literary ideal. Chivalry was a code of conduct that emphasized honor, loyalty, and courtly love, but it applied primarily to how knights treated one another. It did not necessarily extend to the peasantry or the foot soldiers, who were often slaughtered without mercy. Chivalry was a mechanism to limit the lethality of aristocratic warfare, encouraging the taking of prisoners for ransom rather than killing. It was a business transaction as much as a moral code. A prime example of the chivalric ideal and its practical application is William Marshal, who lived in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Rising from a landless younger son to become the regent of England, Marshal was renowned as the greatest knight who ever lived. He made his fortune on the tournament circuit, defeating hundreds of opponents and collecting their horses and armor as prizes. His life illustrates that knighthood was a career where skill and reputation could translate into immense wealth and political power. Marshal served 5 English kings and kept his word through civil wars and political treachery, embodying the virtue of loyalty. Yet he was also a ruthless pragmatist who understood the value of violence. On his deathbed, he claimed to have captured over 500 knights during his career, a testament to his prowess and his business acumen. His story reminds us that the best knights were not just warriors, but shrewd operators who navigated the complex social networks of the feudal world. The tournament was the primary stage where a knight could display his skill and earn glory outside of war. Early tournaments were not the organized jousts of later centuries, but wild melees that ranged across miles of open country. Groups of knights would clash in mock battles that were barely distinguishable from real combat. Limbs were broken, eyes were gouged, and men died in the press. It was a training ground for war where units learned to fight cohesively and individuals proved their worth. As the Middle Ages progressed, the tournament evolved into the highly regulated joust. Two knights would charge at each other along a barrier or tilt, trying to shatter their lances on the opponent's shield. This was a spectator sport attended by ladies and high nobility, filled with pageantry and ritual. The armor for jousting became specialized, often heavier and more restrictive than field armor designed solely for the collision of the lance. While less chaotic than the melee, the joust was still dangerous, and accidental deaths were common. The castle was the physical manifestation of the knight's power over the land. These stone fortresses dominated the landscape, serving as administrative centers, military bases, and residences. Life in a castle was not always comfortable. It was drafty and damp and crowded. However, it was the safest place in a violent world. The knight was responsible for the defense of the castle and the surrounding lands, a duty that required constant vigilance and maintenance of the fortifications. Siege warfare was far more common than open battle, and it was a grueling test of endurance. For the knight, a siege meant weeks or months of boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. He might lead a sortie to burn the besiegers' siege engines or defend the walls against an assault. The threat of starvation and disease was constant, and the lack of sanitation in a crowded fortress could be as deadly as the enemy arrows. Honor was often swallowed by the desperate need to survive. The Crusades brought the European knight into contact with the sophisticated cultures of the Middle East. Here they faced light cavalry and horse archers who used hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the heavy European charge. The heat and the lack of water were formidable enemies, and many knights died without ever seeing combat. Yet those who returned brought back new ideas in architecture and science and luxury goods that transformed European society. The experience of the Crusades expanded the horizons of the knightly class. The decline of the knight was a slow process driven by changing technology and social structures. The rise of professional infantry armed with pikes and halberds began to challenge the supremacy of the cavalry charge. The Swiss pikemen and the Flemish militias proved that disciplined commoners could defeat the flower of nobility. The disaster at Courtrai in 1302, where French knights were massacred by Flemish militia in a muddy ditch, was a harbinger of things to come. The English longbow, as seen at Agincourt, further eroded the dominance of the knight. A weapon that could be mass-produced and mastered by a yeoman threatened the monopoly on violence held by the aristocracy. It forced armor to become heavier and thicker, eventually reaching a point of diminishing returns. The knight could no longer ride with impunity across the battlefield. He had to be cautious and tactical, facing threats that could strike from a distance. However, the true death knell of the traditional knight was the introduction of gunpowder. Early hand cannons and arquebuses were inaccurate and slow, but they could punch through the finest plate armor. As firearms improved, the cost of effective armor became prohibitive, and the mobility of the soldier became more important than his protection. The castle too became vulnerable, as heavy cannons could pulverize stone walls that had stood for centuries. The age of the impregnable fortress and the invulnerable warrior was ending. By the 16th century, the knight had evolved into the heavy cavalryman or gendarme, still an elite unit, but part of a larger professional army. The feudal levy, where knights served for 40 days, was replaced by paid mercenaries and standing armies. The social role of the knight transformed into that of the courtier and the officer. The title of knight became an honorific bestowed for service to the state rather than a job description for a warrior. Despite his obsolescence on the battlefield, the image of the knight continued to captivate the imagination. The ideals of chivalry were romanticized in literature and art, creating a legacy that outlasted the reality. The concept of the gentleman with his code of honor and duty is a direct descendant of the knightly ideal. We still use the language of chivalry to describe acts of bravery and courtesy, proving the enduring power of the archetype. The reality of armored combat was far from the polished tournaments of Hollywood. It was a gritty, exhausting, and terrifying experience where men bludgeoned each other with bars of steel in the mud. It was a world of concussion and heat exhaustion, where a fall from a horse could mean death. The knight was a human being encased in a machine of war fighting for land and status and survival. His life was defined by the weight of his armor and the sharpness of his sword. In the end, the story of the medieval knight is a tragedy of obsolescence. They were the masters of their world for centuries, the undisputed apex predators of the battlefield. But technology and society marched on, leaving them behind as relics of a bygone age. The empty suits of armor standing in museums today are silent witnesses to a time when the fate of nations was decided by the strength of an arm and the courage of a heart. They remind us that no dominance lasts forever and that even the strongest iron must eventually rust.